There is a smell that every tanker knows. Burning hydraulic fluid mixed with diesel smoke and something else, something organic that you do not want to think about too carefully. Private Daniel Kowalski from Chicago knew that smell on September 4th, 1944, in the 3 seconds between the moment the 88mm shell punched through the hull of his Sherman tank and the moment everything went white. He was 20 years old. He had never kissed a girl. His last thought, according to the laws of physics and the testimonies of men who survived similar moments, was probably about his mother's pierogies, or the Cubs, or the girl who worked at the diner on Milwaukee Avenue who smiled at him once. But we will never know because Daniel Kowalski died in a fire inside a 33-ton steel box in France, and his story should have ended there. Except it didn't, because the tank that killed him kept fighting. For the Germans, then for the Russians. Then it vanished for 52 years until a Polish farmer named Joseph hit it with a shovel while digging a drainage ditch behind his barn in the summer of 1997. This is the story of that tank. But more importantly, this is the story of the men who climbed inside it, who trusted their lives to its armor, who scratched their names into its metal skin, and who learned the hard way that in war, even the machines have ghosts. Let me take you back to February of 1944. Detroit, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, Assembly Line Number 7. Imagine the sound. Metal on metal, pneumatic hammers, welding torches, throwing sparks that smell like burning stars. The tank that would later be designated hull number 30548 rolled off that line on a Tuesday afternoon, and nobody noticed it particularly because there were 500 other Shermans rolling off 500 other lines that same week. It was an M4A2 variant, which meant it had a diesel engine instead of gasoline, which meant it was destined for Lend-Lease shipment to the Soviets or the British, because the U.S. Army preferred gas engines for logistics reasons that made sense to someone in a Pentagon office, but would have baffled the men who actually had to fight in these things. But fate, or paperwork, or some clerk's hangover intervened, and hull number 30548 got assigned to the U.S. 2nd Armored Division instead. It was loaded onto a train heading east. It crossed the Atlantic on a Liberty ship that almost got torpedoed twice. It landed in England in March, and it met its first crew at a marshalling yard in Dorset, where the rain never stopped and the mud was deep enough to drown a jeep. Sergeant Robert Mitchell from Canton, Ohio, was 23 years old and had absolutely no business being in charge of 4 other men and a machine that cost more than his father's hardware store. But there he was, standing in the rain, looking at this tank that somebody had told him was his responsibility now, and wondering how the hell he was supposed to keep everyone alive with it. His gunner was Eddie Ramirez from El Paso, a kid who could field strip the 75mm main gun in 7 minutes flat, and who talked constantly about his girl back home, Maria, who wrote him letters every single day. The loader was Jimmy Walsh from Boston, 20 years old, red-headed, manic energy like a caffeinated squirrel. The kind of guy who laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, because if he stopped laughing, he might start thinking about the fact that his job was to load shells in a metal box that people were trying to blow up. The driver was Frank Henderson from Mississippi, slow-talking, steady hands, the best driver in the company, because he treated the Sherman like it was his daddy's tractor and not a temperamental steel beast with a turning radius like an ocean liner. And the assistant driver and bow gunner was Daniel Kowalski, the Chicago kid, quiet, always writing letters home, always talking about the Cubs, even though the Cubs hadn't won anything since before his grandfather was born. They named the tank Motor City Mayhem, painted it in white letters on the turret, added a cartoon fist smashing through a swastika because that's what you did. You personalized your coffin. You made it yours, because if you were going to die in this thing, you wanted it to at least have a personality. They trained together for 2 months. They learned each other's rhythms. Mitchell learned that Ramirez got quiet before a fight and loud after. Walsh learned that Henderson hated being rushed, and if you rushed him, he would slow down even more just to spite you. Kowalski learned that if he hummed while he was nervous, which was always, it drove everyone crazy, but nobody told him to stop, because everyone had their own weird coping mechanism, and humming was pretty harmless compared to some. They became a crew. Not friends, exactly, because friendship implies choice and they didn't choose each other, but something deeper than friends, something like brothers who didn't necessarily like each other but would die for each other anyway, because when you share a steel box that 19 tons of German engineering is trying to turn into a crematorium, you don't really have a choice. They landed on Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944. D-Day +1. The beach was still littered with the debris of the previous day's slaughter. Burned-out tanks, abandoned equipment, things floating in the surf that used to be men. Motor City Mayhem rolled off an LST into 3 feet of cold Atlantic water, and Henderson gunned the diesel engine, and the tank clawed its way up the sand and onto French soil. And they were in the war now, really in it. No more training, no more dry runs, just the real thing with real bullets and real consequences. For the next 3 months, they fought their way through Normandy. The hedgerows were worse than anyone had told them. Every field was a fortress. Every stone wall hid a German with a Panzerfaust rocket launcher, who only needed 1 good shot to turn your tank into a fireball. They learned to shoot first and ask questions later. They learned that the sound of an 88mm gun was different from the sound of a 75, and you could tell which one was shooting at you by the sound alone, and if it was an 88, you had about 2 seconds to do something before physics and geometry conspired to kill you. They knocked out 2 German Stoogie assault guns near St. Lo. They suppressed machine gun nests. They provided cover for infantry who looked at them like they were gods because they had armor, and the infantry had nothing but cloth and hope. And they survived. All 5 of them. Through Normandy, through the breakout, through the race across France, when it seemed like the war might actually be over by Christmas. September 4th, 1944. Near Verdun. That's where it ended for Daniel Kowalski. Company B was advancing in column along a narrow road flanked by woods, which was a bad idea. But all the ideas were bad ideas by that point, because the Germans were supposed to be retreating, but nobody had told the Germans that, and they were still fighting like cornered rats. The lead Sherman got hit by a concealed pack anti-tank gun and brewed up instantly, which is tanker slang for caught fire, and killed everyone inside in about 15 seconds. The column stopped. Mitchell was trying to get a situation report on the radio. Henderson was trying to reverse the tank because the road was too narrow to turn around. Walsh was loading a high-explosive shell because someone thought they had spotted the Pak gun's position. Ramirez was traversing the turret, and Kowalski was doing what he always did, which was manning the bow machine gun and trying not to think about the fact that he was sitting in the most vulnerable position in the tank, right behind a piece of armor that would stop rifle bullets, but not much else. The Tiger tank that killed him was 400 yards away, hidden in a barn with the front doors open, just wide enough for the barrel of the 88mm gun to poke through. The German gunner, whose name we will never know, probably took his time with the shot, because 400 yards is not easy even with German optics, and he would have aimed for the hull, not the turret, because that's where the ammunition was stored, and that's how you made a Sherman burn. The shell hit the right side of the hull, traveling at about 2,800 feet per second, which meant it crossed the distance between the gun and the tank in less time than it takes to blink. It punched through the armor like it wasn't there. It went through Daniel Kowalski like he wasn't there. It detonated against the main ammunition rack. Henderson, who was sitting 3 feet away from the impact point, lost both legs below the knee and somehow lived long enough to be pulled out of the driver's hatch. Mitchell got the order to bail out before the ammunition cooked off and dragged Henderson through the hatch, while Ramirez covered them with a Thompson submachine gun he had grabbed from somewhere, firing blindly at the woods because movement keeps you alive and freezing gets you killed. Walsh tried to get Kowalski out, tried to pull him from the assistant driver's seat, but Kowalski wasn't there anymore. Not in any meaningful sense, and the fire was spreading and the ammunition was starting to pop like firecrackers, and Walsh made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, which was to leave his friend's body behind and jump out of the tank before it turned into a blast furnace. They ran through a wheat field while German machine guns chewed up the ground around them. They made it to a ditch. They survived. Henderson got evacuated. Mitchell and Ramirez and Walsh got assigned to a different Sherman 2 weeks later. None of them ever talked about Motor City Mayhem again, at least not out loud. But all 3 of them dreamed about it for the rest of their lives. Here's what they didn't know. Here's what nobody knew until 1998, when the archival research finally connected all the dots. Motor City Mayhem didn't burn completely. The fire was intense but short. It consumed the hydraulic fluid and the gasoline in the auxiliary tank and Daniel Kowalski's body, may he rest in peace. But the main diesel fuel tanks didn't catch because diesel doesn't ignite as easily as gasoline, and after about 20 minutes the fire burned itself out and left behind a blackened, smoking, seemingly dead tank sitting in the middle of a French road. When German forces retook the area that evening, because the battle was still going and the lines were still fluid and nobody controlled anything for more than a few hours at a time, they found Motor City Mayhem, and they found something else. They found that underneath the burned paint and the carbon scoring, the tank was still mechanically sound. The engine would turn over. The transmission worked. The gun was intact. The Germans, who were desperate for armor because they had left half their panzer divisions burning in Normandy, made a decision that would have seemed insane in any other context, but made perfect sense in the autumn of 1944 when the Third Reich was collapsing and every functional tank was worth its weight in gold. They decided to steal it. Imagine being the German recovery crew tasked with towing an American Sherman back to a field workshop. Imagine the surreal horror of cleaning out the remains of the assistant driver so you could use his seat. Imagine installing German radios and German optics and repainting the whole thing in German Dunkelgelb camouflage with Balkenkreuz crosses on the turret. Imagine doing all of this while American artillery is falling a mile away and the sound of the war is getting closer every day. But they did it. It took 3 weeks, and in late September of 1944, Motor City Mayhem, now painted German yellow and marked with German crosses, rolled out of the workshop near Metz with a German crew and joined the desperate defense of the German border. Feldwebel Klaus Richter was 31 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of 1944, and he had survived the Russian front, which meant he had seen things that would make Normandy look like a training exercise. He had been wounded twice. He had an Iron Cross First Class for knocking out 7 Soviet tanks at Kursk. He had watched friends burn in Panthers and Tigers that were supposed to be invincible, but turned out to be mechanically unreliable pieces of over-engineered garbage that broke down every 50 kilometers. So when he was assigned to command a captured American Sherman, he didn't care about the ideological impurity of fighting in an enemy tank. He cared about one thing: would it start in the morning? And the Sherman, God bless American engineering, started every single morning. It never broke down. It never threw a track. It was slower than a Panther, and it had less armor than a Tiger, but it worked. And in the autumn of 1944, working was more valuable than anything else. Richter's crew consisted of 4 other men whose names have been lost to history except in German casualty reports and personnel files that nobody looks at anymore. They were veterans. They were exhausted. They were grimly determined to survive long enough to see their families again, if their families were still alive, which was increasingly uncertain given the strategic bombing campaign that was turning German cities into rubble. They operated the Sherman for 6 weeks. They fought against the same American forces that had originally crewed it, which is an irony so sharp it could cut. And they knocked out at least 1 American M10 tank destroyer and several half-tracks during skirmishes along the Siegfried Line. Richter grew to love the Sherman in a way he had never loved the temperamental German tanks he had commanded before. It was reliable. It was simple. It didn't require a team of mechanics with engineering degrees to keep it running. And it had one feature that German tanks lacked, a feature so valuable that Richter considered it worth more than armor or speed or firepower. It had a diesel engine, which meant it could run on captured Soviet fuel stocks as well as German diesel, which meant it could keep fighting even when the German logistics system had collapsed into chaos. But in November of 1944, as the Soviet winter offensive loomed and the strategic situation in the East became increasingly catastrophic, Richter's Kampfgruppe was ordered to abandon the Western Front and transfer to Poland to help stem the red tide that was coming. The Sherman was loaded onto a rail car. It traveled east. It arrived in Poland in late November. It was repainted in winter camouflage, white wash over the yellow, and Richter's crew dug in near Poznan to wait for the Soviet onslaught. It came on January 12th, 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive. Over 2 million Soviet troops, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, a tidal wave of steel and fury rolling west to avenge 4 years of German atrocities on Soviet soil. Richter and his crew held a position on the outskirts of a village whose name has been lost, along with everything else about those 3 days. They fought off wave after wave of Soviet infantry. They knocked out 4 T-34 tanks, which was a miracle given that the T-34 was roughly equal to the Sherman in capability, and Richter's success was due entirely to superior crew training and the Sherman's excellent gun optics. But on the morning of January 15th, a Soviet artillery barrage caught them in the open. A 122mm howitzer shell, probably fired from 3 miles away by a crew who had no idea what they were shooting at, landed directly on the left track assembly. The explosion disabled the track and killed 2 of Richter's crew instantly, just erased them from existence, turned them into red mist and ringing ears, and the kind of silence that comes after something so loud that your brain stops processing sound for a few seconds. Richter and the 2 surviving crew members bailed out. They ran through the snow. German machine guns covered their retreat. One of the crew members got hit by Soviet rifle fire and went down screaming. The other got captured. Richter made it back to German lines alone. The Soviets found the disabled Sherman later that day. At first they thought it was a knocked-out German vehicle because of the Balkenkreuz markings and the white camouflage. But Captain Dmitry Volkov of the Red Army's Tank Recovery Service took one look at the hull shape and the suspension and recognized it immediately as an American M4A2. The Soviets had been receiving Shermans through Lend-Lease for 2 years by that point. Volkov had trained on Shermans. He knew every rivet and weld line. He also knew that this particular Sherman had German markings, which meant it had been captured, which meant it was a trophy, which meant it was valuable not just as a tank, but as a propaganda piece. He ordered it recovered. The repairs took less than a week because Soviet field workshops in 1945 were operating at a level of efficiency born from 4 years of total war. A new track assembly was installed. The German radio equipment was ripped out and replaced with Soviet systems. The white camouflage was partially scraped off, revealing the German yellow underneath, which the Soviets left in place because paint was a low-priority resource when you were trying to reach Berlin before the Americans did. They added a large red star to the turret. They stenciled Cyrillic letters on the hull, and they assigned the tank to the 9th Mechanized Brigade under the command of Lieutenant Grigory Petrov. Petrov was 26 years old and looked 50. He had been fighting since the summer of 1941, when the Germans had launched Operation Barbarossa and nearly destroyed the Soviet Union in 6 months. He had survived the siege of Leningrad. He had survived Kursk. He had survived wounds that should have killed him twice. He was a tractor driver before the war, from a village in Ukraine that no longer existed because the Germans had burned it and killed everyone in it, including Petrov's parents and his younger sister. He had nothing to go home to. The war was all he had left, and he was very, very good at it. Petrov's crew consisted of 4 other men, all of them veterans, all of them survivors of battles that had killed millions. They operated the Sherman from late January until April of 1945. They advanced with the Red Army through Poland and into Germany itself. They crossed the Oder River. They fought in a dozen skirmishes whose names nobody remembers. They knocked out German positions. They provided fire support for infantry. They kept the tank running through mud and snow and the kind of mechanical stress that would have destroyed a lesser machine. And then, about 40 kilometers from Berlin, the left track threw itself off the drive sprocket during a night march, and Petrov's crew spent 6 hours trying to repair it before they received orders to fall back, because Soviet High Command wanted only the newest and most reliable tanks for the final assault on Berlin, and this Sherman, now worn out after months of use by 3 different armies, was considered too old and too unreliable for the final push. The tank was left at a supply depot. Petrov and his crew were reassigned to newer T-34 tanks. The war ended 3 weeks later, and Motor City Mayhem, the Sherman that had carried 5 Americans and 5 Germans and 5 Soviets into battle, sat abandoned at a supply depot in eastern Germany while the Third Reich collapsed and the world tried to figure out what came next. This is where the story gets strange. In the final chaotic days of April 1945, as German forces disintegrated and the Wehrmacht ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, there were thousands of abandoned or damaged vehicles scattered across Central Europe. Some were recovered, some were scrapped, some were claimed by whoever found them first, and some, a very few, vanished into the landscape like ghosts. Motor City Mayhem was sitting at that supply depot when a retreating German unit, a ragtag collection of Wehrmacht soldiers and Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth kids who should have been in school, stumbled across it. They had no fuel, they had no food, they had no hope. But they had an officer, a captain whose name was never recorded, but who was described in later testimony as having the kind of eyes that had seen too much and lost the ability to process the concept of surrender. This officer, operating on pure spite and the twisted logic of a regime that was eating itself, gave an order that makes no sense unless you understand that by late April of 1945, nothing made sense anymore. He ordered his men to bury the tank. Why? Because if the Germans couldn't have it, and if they couldn't destroy it properly without explosives they didn't possess, then the Soviets wouldn't have it either. It was insane. It was petty. It was the final act of a military force that had spent 6 years conquering Europe and was now reduced to burying equipment in bomb craters out of spite. But they did it. They used the tank's own winch and a commandeered farm tractor to drag it into a large crater near a barn. They spent an entire night shoveling earth over it. They buried 33 tons of American steel in Polish soil, and then they moved on, heading west to surrender to the Americans or the British or to die somewhere in the chaos, and the tank was left there, underground, forgotten, a time capsule of metal and ghosts. 52 years. That's how long it sat there. The war ended. Germany was divided. Poland became a Soviet satellite state. The Cold War froze Europe into two armed camps. Men who had fought in the war grew old and died. The generation that remembered the sound of tank engines and artillery barrages was replaced by a generation that knew war only from books and films. And in a small village in western Poland, a farmer rebuilt his land. He filled in most of the bomb craters. He plowed his fields. He raised his children. He never knew that there was a Sherman tank buried behind his barn. His son, Joseph, inherited the farm and never knew either. Until the summer of 1997, when Joseph was digging a drainage ditch and his shovel hit something that made a sound like a church bell, deep and resonant and impossibly metallic. What followed was the kind of archaeological excavation usually reserved for Egyptian tombs. The Polish military was notified. They sent experts. They sent equipment. They sent historians who stood at the edge of the excavation site and watched as, over the course of a week, a Sherman tank emerged from the earth like a mechanical resurrection. The tank was in extraordinary condition. The earth had protected it from the elements. The paint was intact. The markings were visible. And when they cleaned the dirt from the hull and examined those markings, they found something that sent them scrambling through archives in 4 different countries. They found evidence of all 3 of its military careers. They found the Balkenkreuz crosses painted over in white winter camouflage. They found the red Soviet star on the turret. They found the serial number stamped on the hull plate, 30548. Built in Detroit in February 1944, assigned to the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. And suddenly they had a mystery that would take a year to solve. The archival research was painstaking. American records showed the tank's original assignment to Sergeant Mitchell's crew. They showed it being lost in action near Verdun on September 4, 1944. German records from the field workshop near Metz showed a captured M4A2, Sherman being repaired and put into service in late September. Soviet records from the 9th Mechanized Brigade showed an M4A2 Sherman with German markings being captured and used from January to April of 1945. The pieces fit together like a puzzle, and what emerged was the story of a tank that had fought for 3 armies, that had crossed Europe twice, that had participated in some of the most brutal fighting of the Second World War, and that had been deliberately buried and forgotten in the final spiteful days of a dying regime. But the most poignant discovery came when they opened the tank's interior. Inside the turret, scratched into the bare metal by men who knew they might die at any moment and wanted to leave some evidence that they had existed, they found graffiti in 3 languages. In English, someone had scratched Mitchell's crew, D-Day +1, we made it. In German, barely legible, someone had carved Richter, Oktober 44, für das Vaterland. In Russian, someone had written Petrov's crew, to Berlin or death. And there was one more inscription, near the assistant driver's position, scratched deep into the metal with something sharp, probably a knife or a screwdriver. It read, Kowalski, Chicago. 4 words, a name and a city. The last trace of a 20-year-old kid who had never kissed a girl and who had died in a fire in France and whose body had been buried in an American cemetery in Normandy after being identified through dental records in 1946. When historians contacted the Kowalski family in Chicago, they found Daniel's niece, a woman in her 70s who had been 3 years old when her uncle died and who had grown up hearing stories about him, but had never known the exact circumstances of his death. She flew to Poland. She stood next to the excavated tank. She looked at her uncle's name scratched into the metal. and she cried for a man she had never known but whose absence had shaped her family's history for 53 years. The tank became the center of an international dispute about ownership and display rights. The Americans wanted it because it was an American tank crewed by American soldiers who had died for their country. The Germans argued it represented an important piece of their military history and should be displayed in a German museum. The Russians pointed out that it had served with the Red Army during the final victorious campaign against fascism. The Polish government noted that it had been found on Polish soil and represented Poland's suffering during the war. The arguments went on for months. Diplomats got involved, museums made proposals, veterans groups weighed in, and finally, a compromise was reached. The tank would be restored to running condition and would rotate among museums in all 4 countries, spending 1 year in each location, maintained as a shared historical artifact belonging to no single nation, but to all of them equally. The restoration took 3 years and cost over $1 million. The work was done by specialists from all 4 countries at a facility in Poland, and during the restoration, they made another discovery. Hidden inside a sealed compartment in the hull, probably placed there by Sergeant Mitchell's crew before they shipped out from England, they found a battered metal box. Inside the box were photographs, letters, a small American flag. The photographs showed 5 young men posing with a tank in England, all of them smiling, all of them impossibly young, none of them knowing what September 4th would bring. The letters were addressed to families back home, written but never mailed, because the crew had planned to send them all at once when they reached Paris, a goal they never achieved. The flag had belonged to Robert Mitchell. When historians tracked down his granddaughter, a woman in her 50s who had never met her grandfather because he had died in a car accident in 1951, she wept when she held the flag and heard the full story of the tank he had commanded for 3 months in 1944. The restored tank made its first public appearance at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in June of 2000. Thousands came to see it. 3 men who had served in the 66th Armored Regiment attended, though none had known Mitchell's crew personally. From there it traveled to Germany, to Russia, to Poland, each time drawing crowds, each time forcing people to confront the complexity of the war, the fact that the same machine had carried men from 3 nations into battle, that all of them had been young and scared and far from home, that all of them had believed they were fighting for something worth dying for. But the most meaningful moment in the tank's second life came in 2002 at the American Cemetery in Normandy. The tank was driven there, its diesel engine running smoothly, and it was parked near the grave of Private Daniel Kowalski. His family was there. Descendants of Robert Mitchell were there. A military chaplain read the names of all the men who had crewed the tank for all 3 armies, Americans and Germans and Russians, and for a few minutes, in a cemetery overlooking the beach where the liberation of Europe had begun, the war's divisions seemed less important than the shared humanity of the men who had fought it. Today, the tank continues its rotation. School children in 4 countries learn its story. Historians study it, veterans touch its armor and remember. And inside the turret, protected now by museum glass, you can still see the scratched words. Mitchell's crew, D-Day +1, we made it. Richter, Oktober 44 für das Vaterland. Petrov's crew, to Berlin or death. And Kowalski, Chicago, 3 armies, 3 crews, 1 machine, and the understanding, purchased at the cost of millions of lives, that the machines of war are just metal and mechanics, but the men who operate them are human beings with names and families and dreams that die with them when the shells start flying. The Sherman tank with serial number 30548 is not just a museum piece. It is a reminder that history is never simple, that war makes ghosts of everyone, and that sometimes, if you dig deep enough, those ghosts speak. And what they say in 3 languages, scratched into bare metal by hands that have been dust for 70 years, is simply this: "We were here, we fought, we mattered. Remember us."